I remember the day I signed those papers like it was carved into glass, clear, unforgiving, and impossible to shatter. Lynette didn't want drama. Neither did I. We met at the courthouse, exchanged polite nods, and watched the judge glance over our files as if he were skimming the morning paper. No tears. No raised voices. Just a stamp and a signature, and suddenly the life I thought I'd built was stripped down to its bare bones. A used sedan with a stubborn transmission, an empty apartment in a building that smelled faintly of mildew, and full custody of my daughter, Soraya. Lynette declared she wasn't mother material, as though nurturing the child we made together were a chore she could simply hand off. I didn't argue. I didn't try to change her mind. The court saw her choice, and mine was obvious. I had no choice but to become everything she refused to be. That first night alone, I stared at the ceiling of our new apartment until the streetlights blinked out. Soraya was with her grandmother, sleeping in a bed that still smelled like her mother's perfume. I sat on the edge of the mattress in our bedroom and thought about the vow I'd made long before any courtroom ever existed. Fatherhood was not optional. It was a promise etched into my soul the moment I heard her first cry. I pictured her 6-year-old face the next morning. Bright-eyed, trusting, and unaware of the changes swirling around her world. I wanted to be the one she woke up to, the one who braided her hair into neat cornrows before school, the one who kissed her forehead when nightmares stole her sleep. I would never let anyone else define her life or mine. I learned quickly that love alone doesn't pay rent. Mondays arrived with steel gray skies that matched my mood as I climbed into the driver's seat of that battered sedan and headed to work. As a financial consultant, I spent my days deciphering balance sheets and forecasting risk for clients I barely knew, all while my mind drifted to Soraya's dance recital rehearsals and math quizzes. I doubled my efforts, not for ambition, but necessity. Every late night spent drilling decimals with her at the kitchen table. Every weekend I sacrificed for parent-teacher conferences. I balanced on a knife's edge between providing and promising. People whispered about the single dad, their eyes soft with pity as if I were a wounded animal they couldn't help. I never asked for sympathy. I only asked for the chance to show up. Braiding Soraya's hair became our sacred ritual. Each strand twisted and tucked held more weight than any boardroom deal I closed. I learned to work with trembling fingers, to search for invisible knots in her soft braids, to talk gently about her dreams while plucking stray hairs from her forehead. I sewed sequins onto her dance costumes, one shimmering rhinestone at a time, feeling the gentle tug of her small hands as she admired her reflection. There was a sparkle in her eyes that outshone any spotlight, and I believed, with every fiber of my being, that her confidence was my invention. Through fevers that turned her cheeks porcelain pink and heartbreaks that racked her body with silent sobs, I stayed awake. I counted her steady breaths and held her hand until her tears ran dry. It was in those small, silent wars that I proved myself, not to the world, but to her. Despite the sacrifices, some mornings felt like walking through a fog of doubt. Would she grow up resenting the father who missed her first lost tooth? Would she curse the name of the man who refused to abandon her when her mother did? I prayed she'd understand that consistency was my gift, patience my weapon, and unconditional love my war cry. When the neighbors' kids ran off to their two-parent homes, I carried Soraya on my shoulders, pretending her world was the only one that mattered. We whispered about college scholarships and the day she'd drive that same sedan, hopefully upgraded by then, to pick me up for brunch. We imagined a life where no one pitted our little family because no one needed to. In the end, the pieces we carried became our mosaic. A faded sedan signified sacrifices and late nights. An empty apartment held the echoes of bedtime stories and whispered affirmations. Full custody was a promise to knit broken dreams into new beginnings. Fatherhood, to me, was never a fallback plan or a temporary role. It was my identity, my purpose, and my vow. When people pitted me, I simply smiled. I never turned away from the pity, because every glance reminded me of how far we'd come. The world might see a man weighed down by circumstance, but I saw myself in Soraya's eyes. A hero crafted from quiet persistence, unwavering devotion, and love that refused to let go. And that was more than enough. Money was tight, but love was loud, echoing through every corner of our little world. I remember the first Sunday morning I rented that office space with Malik. A faded carpet that swallowed the sunlight and walls too thin to muffle the city's pulse. We didn't have posters on the walls or expensive signage out front. Just a hand-lettered nameplate and 2 folding chairs in the waiting area. Clients trickled in by word of mouth. A friend of a friend, a neighbor who'd heard Malik's laugh from down the hall. We didn't advertise. We let quiet power be our style, drawing people to us the way a lighthouse draws ships, steady, reliable, unflashy. I often thought about how this mirrored my fatherhood. No grand declarations, no demands for attention. Instead, I showed up each day, dependable as the sunrise. Each morning before dawn, I would roll out of bed, the smell of last night's coffee still lingering on my sheets, and tiptoe past Soraya's room. The door was always ajar, just enough for moonlight to slant across the floorboards. I paused to watch her once, crumpled in her blankets, hair fanned like a halo around her head. I closed the door gently, grabbed yesterday's suit from the hamper, and headed out. In the car, I packed lunches on the passenger seat. Chicken wraps she liked, crisp apple slices, her favorite granola bar tucked into a small compartment. I tucked a handwritten note on top, "Be brave today. I'll see you after school." It was a simple ritual, but it mattered to both of us. By midday, I was in back-to-back consultations, poring over spreadsheets and listening to clients outline their financial anxieties. "I just want to sleep at night," one of them said, voice tight with worry. I nodded, understanding more than they knew. "We'll get you there," I assured her, offering numbers and strategies. Through every presentation, my mind flickered to Soraya performing her poetry recital that evening. I imagined the stage lights, her voice clear as water, and felt pride bloom in my chest. No matter how many zeros we balanced in accounts, nothing compared to the weight I placed on her confidence, on the knowledge that her world was anchored by my presence. When the clock struck 5, I raced to her school, parking in a spot that always smelled faintly of asphalt tar. I jogged up the sidewalk just in time to see her emerge, backpack bouncing, hair a little frizzy from the day's humidity. She waved, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Dad, you're early," she exclaimed, words tumbling out as she reached me. I knelt, brushed a lock of hair behind her ear, and handed her the leftover granola bar. "Thought you might need it," I replied with a grin. She slapped my shoulder playfully and launched into a story about how her teacher complimented her on a perfect essay. I listened, asked questions, and punctuated each moment with genuine interest. These small exchanges were the mortar that held our lives together. Our evenings followed a comfortable pattern. Homework on the kitchen counter, the hum of the refrigerator as a backdrop. Sometimes, she'd struggle with algebra, and I'd lean over her worksheet, tracing numbers with my finger, reminding her that problems have solutions, even if it takes time to find them. Other nights, she'd curl up on the couch, book in hand, and I'd make popcorn, setting up a makeshift movie night. She'd pick something adventurous, and we'd laugh at the hero's mistakes, then talk about courage afterward. "You think I'm brave?" she'd ask during the credits. Every day, I'd say softly, and she'd tuck her head against my shoulder. On weekends, I became chauffeur, tutor, and cheerleader all at once. I taught her how to drive in the same sedan that felt cramped under our coexistence. Hands at 10 and 2, eyes on the rearview mirror. Her grip tightened at the start, eased as she gained confidence. "That's it," I coached, my voice steady. "Just like life. Keep your eyes forward, hands steady, and trust yourself." When she nailed parallel parking on the 6th try, her victorious whoop echoed through the empty lot. She jumped out, threw her arms around me, and I lifted her off the ground, spinning her once before setting her down. Then came recitals and games, front row seats at dance competitions where I watched her twirl in sequin costume, and basketball courts where I timed her sprints. Teachers called me the consistent one, a title I accepted with quiet gratitude. It wasn't about winning praise. It was the simple acknowledgement that presence mattered. I didn't need applause. I just needed her to know she could count on me. No matter how thin the thread between dreams and reality became, I would always be the anchor. And so, amid ledgers and recitals, lunches and late-night homework, I built our life on small moments, each one a brick laid by love's unyielding hand. The first time I saw Elijah Fontaine, I was proud in a way I hadn't expected, like a father seeing his child take flight for the first time. Soraya had invited me to a university mixer. She insisted I meet the circle of friends she'd found among the chatter and laughter in that high-ceilinged hall. I tightened my tie in the rearview mirror of the sedan, smoothing a stray wrinkle from my suit jacket. I told her I was excited, but inside, I felt an unfamiliar flutter of nerves. This was her world now. Bright lights, new faces, and the promise of adulthood. I climbed the steps and followed her voice through the crowd, pausing when she waved me over. There he was, tall, neat, his dark hair slicked back just enough to look effortless, a confident half-smile curling at his lips. "Elijah, this is my father," Soraya said, her voice soft with a nervous thrill. Elijah extended a hand, strong, warm, and sure. "Mr. Merrick," he said, his tone respectful, his eyes never wavering. I shook his hand and sensed in that moment that he would treat her well. He wasn't flashy, didn't boast about legacy or lineage. Instead, he asked about her studies, listened to her talk about her ambition to become an environmental lawyer, and nodded as if each word were a precious gift. I found myself retreating to the edge of the conversation, content to watch the way his eyes lit up when she laughed, to see how naturally he offered her his jacket when the hall's air conditioning sent a shiver through her shoulders. We drifted from group to group, students clustered around snack tables, a jazz trio in the corner building a hushed soundtrack of saxophone and brush drums. I admired the way Elijah introduced me as his honored guest, slipping my name into the conversation with genuine warmth. I felt Soraya relax beside me, her hand brushing mine as if in silent thanks. I breathed easier. Here was the man I'd prayed she'd choose, someone capable of stepping into her life with the kindness and steadiness I'd worked so hard to provide. And then he appeared, Baron Fontaine, a presence so commanding the room seemed to tilt on its axis. His shoulders were broad enough to fill the doorway, his suit cut to an impossible perfection, and his expression carried the confident disdain of someone accustomed to having every door open at his approach. Elijah stiffened when his father arrived, but only for a moment. Then he offered Baron a respectful nod, and the elder man swept past me without an introduction, his gaze inspecting like an appraiser judging a rare painting at auction. He stopped a few feet away, eyes flicking over my tie. Not quite aligned with my collar, down to the scuff tip of my shoe. "And who might you be?" Baron Fontaine said, voice smooth as fine bourbon, but cold enough to crystallize the air between us. He spoke with that faint accent that signaled old money, generations of expectations wrapped around a name like an heirloom. I noticed the tiny gold cufflinks at his wrist, each engraved with the Fontaine crest, and the way his polished shoes reflected the overhead lights in sharp, perfect rectangles. I recalled the peeling paint in our apartment's hallway, the faded carpet in my office, and suddenly my world felt threadbare against his. "I'm Julius Merrick," I said, keeping my tone steady. "Soraya's father." He blinked once, as though he were trying to register meaning from an unexpected variable in his equation. "Ah," he said, as if he'd just solved a puzzle. "You've done your part." His words were clipped, the kind of dismissal that feels more violent than an insult. He didn't elaborate. He gave a single curt nod, turned on his heel, and rejoined the cluster of guests who seemed to await his approval like planets in orbit around a star. I felt Soraya's gaze on me, searching my expression. Her hand slid into mine, fingers warm, trembling just slightly. In that moment, I realized what mattered most wasn't the emptiness in his tone or the luxury in his attire. It was the fact that my daughter needed me to stand firm, to show her a lesson no amount of wealth could teach, that love isn't measured by what you possess, but by the courage to claim your worth in the face of scorn. So I stayed. I didn't excuse myself or shrink away. I stayed for her. I stayed because she'd watched me braid her hair through miles of doubt and stitch sequins onto her dreams when they fluttered free. I stayed because I'd held her close through fevers and heartaches. If a man like Baron Fontaine wanted to test me, I'd let him. If he thought I was maintenance or part of the staff, that was his failing, not mine. The broken sedan in the parking lot, the modest office I rented with Malik, the tatters of my patience, they were badges of devotion, not shame. We rejoined the group near the jazz trio, and Elijah greeted me with an easy smile. He offered a drink, then pulled up a chair beside us, listening to Baron make small talk with potential donors as if he intended to absorb every ounce of their resources. I sipped my water, kept my shoulders straight, and let the warmth of Soraya's gratitude settle around us. In that moment, the mixer's lights glowed softer, the music grew richer, and I knew that regardless of the barbs flung my way, I was exactly where I needed to be, by my daughter's side, unwavering and proud. And when the night ended and I drove us home, Soraya leaned against me in the front seat and whispered, "Thank you, Dad. I smiled, brushing a stray curl from her cheek, and replied, always. I watched the invitations arrive in sleek, cream-colored envelopes embossed with gold filigree, each one a promise of elegance and tradition. I slipped my thumb under the flap of the first, feeling the weight of its cardstock between my fingers. Soraya stood beside me at the kitchen counter, her eyes shining as she imagined every detail of the day, the soft bloom of peonies lining the aisle, the gentle murmur of guests arriving, the sparkle of her own gown under the chapel's stained glass windows. I smiled at her excitement, but beneath my calm I felt the familiar twitch of unease when I thought of Baron Fontaine and the world he represented. This wedding was meant to celebrate love, but often I wondered whose love it truly honored. As weeks passed, I found myself quietly funding things no one ever asked about. I transferred deposits for the venue, covered the floral arrangements when the florist accidentally doubled the bill, and snuck away to the tuxedo shop one evening to arrange payment for Elijah's custom suit after Baron's company card mysteriously declined. The tailor, a kindly older man with a soft French accent, whispered his thanks when I left. "Monsieur Merrick, you have a daughter very lucky to have a father like you," he said, brushing a stray thread from the lapel. I nodded, tucking the compliment away, my satisfaction unfolding in a quiet ache. I never mentioned any of it to Soraya. I preferred my generosity unannounced, like a secret current beneath still waters. Meanwhile, I watched Baron from a distance, his silhouette across crowded rooms a study in entitlement. He showed up at meetings only when it suited him, never bothering to learn Soraya's circle of friends or acquaintances, just slipping his name into conversation and accepting praise for things he neither planned nor paid for. He took credit for Elijah's successes as if they were heirlooms he'd polished to shine brighter. I saw him extend his hand to guests with a measured smile, but when he looked at me, it was the same cold appraisal, a man he could dismiss without consequence. He never once bothered to learn my name. In the whispers of the ballroom, people referred to me politely as the ex, or brushed past with a murmur of the man who raised her. Even my daughter's fiancé once called me, "your daughter's dedicated caretaker," as though my decades of devotion were a footnote in someone else's story. One afternoon, I accompanied Soraya to a fitting for her wedding dress. The atelier was a soft blush of silk and lace, the air perfumed with gardenias. As she watched herself in the mirror, turning slowly so the seamstress could pin the hem, I felt a swell of pride. She looked regal, serene, every inch the bride she had dreamed of being. I held her hand as the fitting ended, and in the quiet hush of the room, she squeezed my fingers. "Thank you for everything," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I brushed a kiss to her temple and told her it was my honor. I meant it. Yet every time we left that atelier, Baron's absence pressed against us. He didn't attend fittings, didn't ask about adjustments or alterations. He treated the process like ticking boxes on a corporate ledger rather than moments to cherish. I wondered if he understood what he was building, or if he saw my daughter's wedding as another acquisition to bolster their family's reputation. He wore his wealth like armor, polished and impenetrable. I wore my patience like a blade, honed sharp but concealed. I had never needed to draw it, but I knew the day would come when I would have to prove that generosity and love aren't dictated by net worth. As the wedding day approached, the tension between us grew almost tangible. During a final walkthrough of the chapel, Baron arrived unannounced, strolling through the aisle with a small entourage in tow. He inspected every pew, every lantern, offering curt nods to caterers and decorators while I stood to the side, watching Soraya adjust a ribbon on the kneeler. He approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder in a display that felt rehearsed, triumphant. "It all looks wonderful," he said, glancing at me with a polite but condescending smile. "You've made an excellent choice, my dear." I met his gaze steadily, wondering how many times he'd practiced that tone in his head, how many times he'd slid between social strata without a second thought. "I'm glad you approve," I said softly, stepping forward. My words carried more weight than I intended, but they cut through the air like steel. Baron turned to me, arching an eyebrow. I felt Soraya tense beside me, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she tapped her hand against my arm to steady me. I drew a slow breath and reminded myself that this wasn't my moment for confrontation. Not yet. This wedding day was hers. She deserved to walk down that aisle without witnessing the clash of old money and new devotion. So I let him have his space. I nodded once and stepped back, returning my attention to Soraya. I lifted the train of her gown and asked the seamstress about final alterations. Together, we worked in hushed cooperation, smoothing silk folds as Baron and his entourage drifted away to inspect the reception hall. I saw him glance over his shoulder once, eyes briefly flicking to me before focusing on the chandeliers he had insisted be crystal rather than glass. I understood then that recognition for my contributions would never come easily, if it came at all. But that didn't matter. The day was not about his goodwill. It was about my daughter's choices, about her stepping into a new chapter with love as her guide and integrity as her foundation. Late that evening, as I walked Soraya home through the hush of lamplit streets, she slipped her hand into mine and said, "Tomorrow, everything feels like it starts anew." I squeezed her hand and replied, "Every tomorrow is a chance to show who we are." She stopped beneath the soft glow of a street lamp, turned to me, and her eyes held both gratitude and determination. "Thank you, Dad," she said, "for being my sword and my shield." I kissed her forehead and whispered, "Always." In that moment, I knew that no paper crown, no embroidered invitation, no dismissive glance could ever diminish the truth of who I was, a father whose love was forged in quiet sacrifice, ready to defend his daughter with unwavering pride. The evening air outside the rehearsal dinner venue was cool against my skin, a welcome contrast to the tension simmering inside the grand hall. I paused at the threshold, smoothing my jacket and taking a deep breath before stepping into the glow of chandeliers and the soft murmur of gathered guests. Long tables draped in ivory linen stretched through the room, candles flickering like fireflies along the center, and clusters of blush roses nestled among polished glassware. Soraya stood beside me, radiant in a simple but elegant dress that shimmered under the lights. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, her eyes bright with excitement tinged by nerves, an echo of my own first dates, long ago. I slipped her hand into mine, drawing reassurance from her grip as we found our place near the head table. Baron Fontaine ascended the small platform at the front with an air of practiced confidence. He cleared his throat, just loud enough to command attention, and smiled broadly, though the curve of his lips didn't reach his eyes. "Friends, family, and honored guests," he began, his voice smooth as polished marble. "Tonight, we celebrate more than just a union between two people. We celebrate the joining of legacies, of traditions, and of a name that carries weight in every room it enters." A ripple of polite applause greeted him, and he paused, eyes scanning the crowd until they settled on me. My heart stuttered for a moment, but I held my posture, refusing to let my shoulders tighten or my face betray the prickle of insult. He didn't acknowledge me by name. Instead, he gestured broadly, as if including all present, yet somehow excluding the man who had raised his daughter. He continued, oblivious or unconcerned, speaking of the Fontaine family's storied history, the bank founded by generations past, the philanthropic foundations, the art collections, the estates that bore the family crest. He spoke of responsibility, duty, and the honor of passing such heritage to the next generation. When he concluded, he offered what he called a heartfelt toast to the future. Glasses lifted, and gentle murmurs of "Here, here," echoed among the guests. Across the table, I caught Soraya's eye. I saw her inhale sharply, her cheeks flushing as if the air in the room had grown suddenly too hot. She offered me a small, apologetic smile, and I squeezed her hand, conveying, "I hear you. It's okay." After the clinking of glasses subsided, guests clustered around Baron, offering polite congratulations, friendly pats on the back. I watched as he received each with the same cool grace he displayed at the podium. I could see the unspoken question dancing in their eyes. Who is this man who dares occupy the same celebration? I sensed their curiosity, their surprise, their polite caution. I felt the weight of their inquiries hang between us, as if I needed to justify my presence among this elite circle. But the man I was, Julius Merrick, needed no validation except the knowledge that I had given everything for this night to happen. Later, as the room grew quieter and diners moved between courses, Soraya slid into the seat beside me. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know he planned to make it about." She let the sentence trail off, the hurt in her eyes unmistakable. I placed a hand on her shoulder and looked across the table at Baron, who was engaged in conversation with the florist about last-minute touches. "Don't apologize," I said softly. "He doesn't get to decide what this day is about. We do." I paused to let the words sink in, to let her feel the reassurance I meant to impart. Respect isn't something you ask for. It's something you let people choke on when the time is right. She met my gaze, a subtle fierceness flaring in her eyes. I knew she understood. As the roast beef course was cleared and the dessert platters arrived, the energy in the room shifted. Conversations floated around us. Speculations about seating charts, laughter at shared memories, gentle ribbing between cousins. Yet every so often, my presence or absence hovered at the edge of their voices. I noticed how some guests leaned forward when I spoke, interested in my perspective on financial planning or intrigued by my daughter's scholarships and accolades. I realized then that the respect I earned was not up to Baron or anyone else. It was built on years of silent service, of unwavering devotion, of showing up when it mattered most. When the final toast came, an offering by Soraya herself, she stood and looked out at the gathered faces. She held her glass high and spoke with a clear, confident voice that made the room fall silent. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began. "Dad has been my constant, my rock, and the reason I stand here without fear of the future. He showed me that love is not inherited. It's built in every moment of care and sacrifice." My throat tightened as she continued. "I hope one day to be half the person he is." Glasses clinked again, but this time I felt the sincerity in each nod, each smile, each lifted eyebrow. After the dinner concluded, guests drifted into the adjoining lounge for coffee and dancing. I stayed back with Soraya for a moment, framing her face in the soft glow of wall sconces. She leaned into me and whispered, "Thank you for always reminding me who I am." I smiled and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "You taught me who I am," I replied. "A father is nothing without his daughter." In her eyes, I saw pride and love reflected back, more powerful than any legacy Baron Fontaine could claim. And in that moment, I knew our truth had won the night. Respect earned by love and dedication, shining brighter than any paper crown or gilded toast. The morning sun filtered through the chapel's stained glass windows and shards of rose and amber as I adjusted the collar of my suit jacket, smoothing a wrinkle I was certain hadn't been there moments ago. My hands trembled only slightly, just enough to remind me how much this day meant. I stepped into the aisle, the soft murmur of guests settling in their pews greeting me like distant waves. My breath caught when I saw Soraya, her gown spilling around her like a pool of ivory silk, her eyes glistening with both excitement and the weight of the moment. I reached for her hand, and she slipped into my side, leaning against me with the trust of a child who never doubted her father would always stand tall. The organ's first chord resonated through the sanctuary, deep and steady, calling us forward. Each step I took beside my daughter felt like an affirmation. Proof that despite every hardship, every lonely night spent poring over our household ledger instead of bedsheets, we had arrived here together. I felt the soft carpet under my polished shoes and focused only on the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. My world shrank to her smile, the echo of her laughter as we practiced our recessional under a canvas of flickering candles just days before. No force on earth could shake the quiet pride that surged through me with every footfall. At the altar stood Elijah, his expression awash with emotion. When Soraya stepped into his waiting arms, his eyes glistened like polished onyx, and I felt the familiar tug of relief. He was where he belonged, holding the woman we both loved most. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe fully, to soak in the beauty of that union. The minister's words wove a tapestry of shared promises and enduring love, but my gaze never left my daughter's face. I watched the smallest crease of joy around her eyes, the way her lips curved when Elijah squeezed her hand. In that instant, the years of sacrifice, the modest sedan, the cramped apartment, the wrist-deep in sequins and tantrums, felt distilled into a single truth. Love, unwavering and unguarded, could create a home even in the most unlikely places. When the minister invited us to exchange rings, Baron Fontaine approached with his own polished composure, slipping Soraya's mother's family heirloom band onto her finger as though performing some sacred rite. I noticed the slight hesitation in Soraya's gaze, an unspoken question of whose intent to honor, and I swallowed a sudden swirl of bitterness. How often had I watched her choose restraint over confrontation, patience over fury? I closed my eyes for just a moment and reminded myself that this ceremony belonged to her, not to me or to Baron or to anyone who judged from the sidelines. I opened them to see Elijah's steady hand and Soraya's unwavering courage, and I smiled. The minister pronounced them married, and the chapel erupted in applause that fluttered around us like confetti. I lifted Soraya's hand to my lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Elijah reached out and embraced me, his grip firm and grateful, as though he recognized how much had gone into shaping the woman he vowed to love. I returned his handshake, nodding once, meaning more than words ever could. Then Baron Fontaine stepped forward, eyes cool and distant, and offered me a terse nod. I inclined my head in return, acknowledging both his presence and our unspoken truce. He did not grasp my hand, did not meet my gaze, and yet I found a measure of satisfaction in our shared space at that altar, a silent recognition that bloodline and heritage meant nothing compared to the bond forged by unwavering devotion. Outside the chapel doors, the spring air smelled of magnolias and new beginnings. Guests lined the walkway, tossing rose petals in gentle arcs. I lifted Soraya's hand above her head and guided her down the aisle, her laughter blending with the music of petals falling. Each step was a triumph over every obstacle we'd faced together. I felt the weight of the petals at my feet, softness beneath stubborn soles, and I thought about how something so delicate could leave such an imprint. Perhaps that was the truest metaphor for our journey. Small, consistent actions, multiplied over time, left a mark too profound to overlook. When the reception began, I watched from the edge as family and friends offered congratulations, their voices sliding around us in waves of warmth. Elijah's mother embraced Soraya. My own sister pressed a tearful hug into my shoulder. I smiled at each gesture, my heart a buoyant vessel of gratitude. But when I turned and saw Baron lingering near the hors d'oeuvres table, examining the imported cheeses with a faint air of entitlement, my chest tightened again. He caught my gaze and raised his own effortlessly, unspoken challenge flickering in his eyes. I raised an eyebrow in response, a subtle acknowledgement that I was still here, still center stage in the life he tried to script. I found Soraya across the room, her profile illuminated by candlelight as she spoke with her grandfather. I slipped beside her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. She leaned into me, warmth spreading through her lean frame. "Thank you for today," she whispered, her voice catching on unshed tears. I brushed her cheek with my thumb and murmured, "I'd do it all over again. Every struggle, every sleepless night, if it meant getting to walk you down this aisle." She pressed her cheek against mine, a moment of intimacy that outshone every glittering centerpiece in the hall. Later, as the dance floor filled and the band struck up a lively tune, Soraya tugged my hand. "Dance with me, Dad," she said. I lifted the edge of my jacket and stepped into the swirl of spinning guests. We found a quiet corner and moved together in time to the music, our steps imperfect but in sync. I dipped her gently, and she laughed, her joy weaving a tapestry of light around us. In that moment, I realized that respect wasn't given at the altar or awarded in a toast. It was earned in every sacrifice made, every promise kept, every presence given without reservation. As the night deepened and the final chords faded, I watched my daughter and her new husband share their first kiss as a married couple. A blush spread across Soraya's cheeks, and I felt a triumphant pride blossom in my chest. Baron Fontaine offered no toast, no final word. He simply watched, perhaps sensing the truth he could never deny, that legacy and wealth were hollow without love's steadfast foundation. I stood tall beside Soraya, knowing that when the world finally looked at me, they would see a father who lived his vow, and at last, even the most disdainful eyes would have no choice but to look up. The music swelled around us in the grand ballroom, strings and piano weaving a tapestry of celebration, but my senses felt razor-sharp as Baron Fontaine stood at the center of the room, commandeering the microphone as though he were announcing a quarterly earnings report. Candles flickered in crystal votives along the tables, their warm light dancing across guest faces and casting long shadows that trembled like specters on the draped walls. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, Soraya's hand resting lightly on my arm, her head turned toward Baron with that same hopeful curiosity she wore whenever she believed in the goodness of people. I clenched and unclenched my fist, tasting the metallic tang of anger in my mouth, determined to remain her anchor. Unyielding, unshaken, Baron's voice cut through the melody, smooth as silk but hiding a razor's edge. To fatherhood, he began, raising his glass in a gesture that seemed choreographed, rehearsed, perfected. We celebrate the men who provide, who build legacies, and who teach their children the value of heritage. He paused, surveying the crowd as though seeking affirmation. Glasses glittered in half-lit anticipation, and I felt the room hold its breath with him. Then he shifted his gaze toward me, tilting his head as if appraising a lesser model in a showroom. "It's one thing to raise a child," he continued, voice light, almost affectionate, another to be someone worth remembering. A polite ripple of laughter followed, the kind that glances around for approval as it fades. Heat flared behind my eyes, and I tasted the sting of betrayal. Not just for myself, but for every moment I'd braided Soraya's hair at dawn, every time I'd sat beside her hospital bed during fevers, every night I'd whispered hope into her ear when the world seemed too heavy for her 6-year-old shoulders. Baron Fontaine wasn't just insulting me. He was denigrating every lesson I'd taught Soraya about love, sacrifice, and resilience. My chest tightened as his words sank into the hush that fell over the room. Some men raise flowers in borrowed gardens, he said, tone carefully neutral, but let's give credit to the ones who built the house. With that, he lifted his glass again, as though toasting his own brilliance, and stepped back. I felt Soraya's gaze on me, wide with surprise and heat with indignation. Her grip on my arm grew taut, as though she wanted to claw his words from my skin. The guests around us exchanged uneasy glances. Some shifting in their seats, some lowering their eyes toward their napkins, and a few brave souls daring to stare in my direction, waiting to see how I would respond. The band faltered, an unsteady note trembling through the air, and for a heartbeat the entire hall was suspended in expectation. I straightened my shoulders, turning my face toward Baron as though I were facing an inevitable storm. I could feel the collective weight of 100 pairs of eyes upon me, each reflecting curiosity, sympathy, judgment, or even quiet admiration. I inhaled slowly through my nose, drawing strength from the memory of every sunrise spent preparing Soraya's lunch, of every evening I held her when she cried herself to sleep, of every sacrifice made without a thought of recognition. Then I exhaled and stepped forward, each movement deliberate and calm, until I stood before him. I took the microphone from the side table, the cool metal firm against my palm. The hall grew unnaturally quiet, so quiet I could hear the rustle of silk gowns and the soft thump of a waiter's shoes against the carpet. I cleared my throat softly, letting the hush settle before speaking. "Baron," I said, voice steady, carrying the weight of every unspoken moment between us. "Do you even know who you're speaking to?" I saw his lips twitch in surprise as he blinked, the mask of cultivated composure slipping for the briefest moment. "You've used my company's portfolio 4 times for your own business ventures," I continued, each word deliberate, resonating against the hush. "My firm audits the board that licensed your bank charter. The suit you're wearing? I financed the tailor you said you admired, but couldn't quite afford with a company card." A faint murmur rippled through the guests. Disbelief, shock, a growing awareness that the foundations of Baron's arrogance were built on my silent labor. I paused, letting the revelation hang in the air like mist before sunrise, then turned my gaze to the crowd. "I'm not just the man who raised Soraya," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'm the man who built everything you've tried so hard to fake. Every asset you flaunt, every legacy you claim. It's rooted in work I did without expecting your praise, without seeking your approval." My pulse throbbed in my temples as I heard Soraya gasp softly, her hand tightening around mine. I glanced down at her, offering a small, reassuring smile. Her eyes shone with pride, and I knew she understood that truth was more powerful than any legacy purchased or inherited. Turning back to Baron, I set the microphone down with quiet finality. "I didn't come here to embarrass anyone," I said in a softer tone, my gaze sweeping the room. "But I refuse to be spoken about like I'm invisible. My name is Julius Merrick. I raised my daughter without an inheritance, without a safety net, and without hoping that someone would stand up for me. Every dollar in this wedding came from my efforts. Every moment of joy she's experienced is because I showed up, day after day, year after year, when it would have been easier to walk away." A hush held the room in rapt attention, broken only by the steady hum of the air conditioning and the distant echo of that opening string chord. I stepped away from the microphone and moved toward my seat, the air around me crackling with unspoken admiration. Guests began to look at each other, eyes bright with newfound respect or remorse. Soraya rose and approached me, her eyes wet with proud tears. She reached out, and I embraced her, the warmth of her gratitude washing through me. In that embrace, I felt the weight of Baron's insult dissolve, replaced by the knowledge that truth, born of unwavering dedication, is the mightiest armor a person can wear. And as I held my daughter close, I realized that respect earned in silence could roar louder than any taunt spoken into a microphone. I watched the flicker of candlelight dance across the polished mahogany table as guests settled into their seats for the final toast. The soft murmur of conversations ebbed and flowed like the tide, and somewhere in the distance a violinist tuned her strings, preparing to fill the room with a gentle coda. I sat beside Soraya, the knot of tension in my chest loosening at the sight of her poised elegance. Her white gown swept the floor, delicate lace hugging her shoulders, and her hair was arranged in a cascade of soft curls. I reached out, brushing a fingertip against her hand. She gave me a quiet nod, the kind we had shared since she was a little girl learning to ride her bike. No words needed, only understanding. When the maitre d' approached with the microphone, the room hushed. Wine glasses paused midway to lips, and all eyes turned toward him. He cleared his throat, his practiced grace enough to command attention without a single harsh note. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice warm and measured. "Before we conclude this most joyous celebration, Mr. Merrick has requested a few words." A ripple of gentle surprise passed through the guests, some smiles of curiosity, others of guarded anticipation. I stood, smoothing my jacket with one hand as the other gripped the microphone stand. Every step toward the head of the room felt laden with the weight of years of unseen sacrifices, of mornings spent braiding hair and evenings spent poring over invoices. I looked out at the faces before me, friends I had never met, relatives I would never know, colleagues I had never courted. I saw the shimmer of crystal chandeliers overhead and the soft glow of candlelight reflecting in polished wine glasses. I cleared my throat, breathing deeply, reminding myself that this speech was not for me or for Baron Fontaine. It was for Soraya and for every moment we had built together. I raised the microphone and began. "Thank you all for being here," I said, voice steady, carrying each word with intention. "Tonight is a celebration not just of love, but of journeys. Every person in this room has played a part in ours. Friends who offered kind words, colleagues who trusted us with their futures, and family members who stood by us when the path was uncertain." I paused, letting the warmth of shared history settle. Heads inclined in gentle acknowledgement, and I continued. "But tonight, I'd like to speak of something deeper, the quiet constancy of a promise kept." I turned toward Soraya, heart swelling at the sight of her steady gaze. "From the day she was born," I said, "I promised to be her anchor. I didn't promise perfection, only presence. I didn't promise a life free of hardship, only a commitment to face every challenge by her side. When her mother and I went our separate ways, she lost one parent, but I gained a purpose. I dedicated every waking hour to proving that love isn't divided, it multiplies when it's shared." I felt her hand press against mine, a silent affirmation that those early nights of tears and broken dreams had not been in vain. "I did not inherit vast estates or silver spoons," I continued, voice clear, rising with conviction. "I inherited a sedan with a troublesome transmission, an apartment that echoed with loneliness, and a child who depended on me for the smallest seam of her costume to the warmth of her goodnight kiss. I built my firm from scratch, not to chase fortune, but to build a foundation, a home where my daughter could feel secure. Every customer I served, every spreadsheet I balanced, I did with the thought of her future in mind. I felt the room's temperature shift, as though the air itself had grown denser with meaning. Then I let my gaze shift to Baron Fontaine, who sat at the head table, his polished composure faltering as he realized the depth of my words. I did not address him directly. Instead, I spoke into the shared space between all of us. If respect were measured by bank accounts, I'd never stand here. If worth were determined by lineage, our story would end at the courthouse steps where the judge signed our divorce decree. But respect is earned through devotion, and worth is proven by the lives we lived. My daughter stands beside me this evening because of unwavering commitment, from sewing sequins late into the night, to braiding hair before dawn, to lending my name to every success she's achieved. A hush fell over the room as I concluded. So here's my toast. To my daughter, whose courage and kindness give my life meaning. To her new husband, who I trust will honor her with the same loyalty I have tried to embody. And to all of you, may you remember that true legacy is not in what you own, but in the hearts you touch. I raised my glass, and for a moment, time held still. Then glasses lifted in unison, wine sparkling like rubies under the candlelight. Soraya rose and took the final sip from her glass before leaning over to embrace me in front of everyone. I felt the collective warmth of nodding heads, the the gentle applause that grew in volume until it filled the hall with thunderous appreciation. Tears glistened in Soraya's eyes as she whispered, "Thank you, Dad." I brushed a kiss to her cheek, pride burning brighter than any chandelier. As I returned to my seat, I noticed Baron Fontaine's expression had softened. No words passed between us. None were needed. His stiff posture had eased, replaced by a grudging respect that flickered behind his eyes. When the night drew to a close, I stood in the doorway with Soraya, watching his guests bid us farewell. Their expressions held something new, the understanding that strength need not roar. It can shine quietly, steadfast in its purpose. Later, as we walked into the cool night air, Soraya slipped her arm through mine. "You gave me everything," she said softly. I smiled, feeling the echoes of the evening's applause still resonating in my bones. "No," I replied. "You gave me everything." Under the soft glow of the street lamp, we paused, and I realized that in living my vow, I had found a legacy far richer than any fortune, a bond of love that would endure long after the last candle flickered and the final song faded. And that was a truth worth remembering. When the room settled into the soft hum of conversation, I felt the weight of every gaze settle on me. The husband, the father, the man they'd underestimated. The applause for Baron's final remark had drifted away, replaced by polite chatter and the clinking of ice in crystal glasses. I stood, smoothing the lapels of my jacket, and walked to the small podium where the microphone awaited like an unspoken invitation. Each step felt measured, deliberate, echoing the promises I'd made to myself and to Soraya over the years. I reached out and lifted the microphone, the polished metal cool against my fingertips, and for a moment I paused to let the hush embrace the space between the tables and the central dance floor. I cleared my throat, a gentle sound that rippled through the attentive silence. "Thank you all," I began, keeping my voice low and steady so that only those leaning forward could hear the tremor of emotion beneath the words. I didn't come here tonight to steal the spotlight or to score points against anyone. I came to honor the real reason we're gathered, the love between two people and the community that supports them. I let that sink in, watching faces tilt in curiosity, surprise, relief. Then I exhaled and leaned into the moment. "You've already heard about legacy and inheritance," I continued, tilting my head slightly toward Baron Fontaine's empty chair at the head table. "But I want to talk about legacy of a different kind, the legacy we build when we show up, day in and day out, for someone who depends on us." I straightened and felt the familiar pull of past mornings spent feeding Soraya breakfast when her eyelids were too heavy to open, past nights spent beside her bed until fevers broke, past afternoons wrestling with algebra problems until they yielded to understanding. I spoke of those moments, one after another, weaving them into a tapestry of devotion. "My daughter once asked me why I stayed," I said, letting the words drift softly across the room. She said, "Dad, you didn't have to raise me alone." And I told her, "I chose you. Every day, I choose you." I watched as Soraya's eyes glistened with tears, her hand resting on the edge of the podium to steady herself. I met her gaze and then turned to the crowd. That choice was never easy. It meant sacrifices that no one sees. The used sedan that sputters down the highway, the empty apartment that echoes with loneliness, the nights when I worked my fingers to the bone so she'd never doubt her worth. Yet each sacrifice was a brick in the home I built for her. A murmur of understanding rippled through the guests, some nodding, others wiping their cheeks with serviettes. I allowed the silence to linger before drawing the final chord of my toast. "So here's to legacy," I said, raising my glass high. Not of bank accounts or family crests, but of unwavering commitment. To every parent who stays when it would be easier to leave, to every friend who shows up when it would be easier to walk away, and to all of you who stand here tonight, witnessing love in its most honest form. I held the gaze of each person in turn, offering gratitude for their presence and for their willingness to see beyond titles and expectations. Then I turned to Soraya, the light of the candles dancing in her eyes. "And to you, my daughter," I said, voice breaking just enough to draw her into the moment. "You taught me that true worth isn't measured in wealth, but in the depth of our love and the strength of our devotion. I am who I am because of you." Her hand slipped into mine, and I squeezed gently, feeling the warmth of her promise. "May your marriage be built on the same foundation, mutual respect, shared sacrifice, and boundless love." The glasses rose in a ripple of affirmation, and the room erupted in heartfelt applause that filled every corner of the hall. Tears glistened on cheeks, and strangers exchanged looks of genuine warmth. In that moment, I realized I had given more than a toast. I had given a testament to the power of silent devotion made visible. I stepped down from the podium, returning the microphone with quiet dignity, and embraced Soraya as the crowd parted around us. Her head rested against my chest, and I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of her hair and the lingering notes of my own words. Elijah joined us then, wrapping his arms around us both in a single, triumphant hug. I felt his gratitude in the strength of his handshake, his whispered thanks in my ear. Baron Fontaine stood across the room, watching us, his expression unreadable but softened. No words passed between us, but something shifted. An acknowledgement that the measure of a man is not in the titles he claims, but in the vows he keeps. As the music resumed and the dance floor cleared for a father-daughter dance, Sean, our old friend and the band's saxophonist, lifted a single, soulful note that spiraled upward like an exhale of relief and joy. I took Soraya's hand and led her to the center of the floor, our steps imperfect but synchronized in the language we spoke: love, trust, and the unbreakable bond we'd forged. And as we swayed beneath the chandelier's glow, the hustle of the night faded away. In its place remained a simple truth: respect earned by devotion shines brighter than any toast or legacy, and when that truth is spoken, even the highest of voices falls silent in reverence. The ballroom had thinned by night's end, leaving only the closest family and friends to share in the final moments of celebration. The grand chandeliers cast a soft, golden glow over the polished floor, and a slow, lilting waltz drifted from the bandstand. I stood at the edge of the dance floor, surveying the faces of those who remained, some nursing desserts, others lingering over last sips of champagne. It felt like the perfect moment for a quiet reckoning, the air thick with the remnants of laughter and the promise of new beginnings. Soraya emerged from the lounge, her gown's hem catching the light as she walked toward me. She carried herself with a serene confidence, a graceful reminder of the woman she had become. I watched her shoulders relax as she approached, her smile wide and genuine. Elijah followed close behind, his hand resting lightly on her waist. When they reached me, Elijah offered a nod of respect, and Soraya slipped her hand into mine. Together, we turned to face the few remaining guests. Our audience for this final act of the evening. Elijah, Soraya, I began, my voice carrying softly across the room. Thank you for this night, for allowing me to stand beside you again, not just as your father, but as a witness to the life you're building together. I paused, feeling the gentle brush of her fingers against mine, and continued. I've watched you navigate every twist and turn, from the first days of your courtship to this moment where you stand hand in hand, ready to face the world as husband and wife. My gaze swept the room, landing on familiar faces whose lives had intertwined with ours. Malik, offering a thumbs up from across the bar. My sister, her eyes shining with pride. Michael and Vanessa, the childhood friends who had cheered me on through every challenge. Each smile, each nod, was a testament to the community that had witnessed our journey. I shifted my gaze back to the happy couple. There was a time, I said, voice steady, when the world told me I couldn't raise my daughter alone. When people saw a used sedan in an empty apartment and assumed that our story was one of lack. I inhaled, recalling the countless mornings spent packing lunches, the late nights spent sewing sequins, the weekends filled with recitals and games. But here's the truth. What we lacked in material wealth, we more than made up for in love, sacrifice, and relentless dedication. Every thread of that wedding gown, every petal in the floral arrangements, every note of tonight's music, it all flowed from that same well of devotion. Soraya's eyes glistened with tears, and Elijah squeezed her hand in solidarity. I nodded toward Baron Fontaine, who stood quietly at the back of the room, his arms crossed but his posture less rigid than before. Even those who questioned my worth learned a lesson tonight, I said, voice rich with meaning. Not because of anything I said or did for myself, but because my actions spoke louder than any inherited title. When you build a life on the foundation of unwavering love, people eventually look up and see the strength of the pillars beneath. I took a deliberate breath and lifted a glass of amber-hued whiskey from a nearby side table. The warmth of the liquid mirrored the warmth in my chest. So here's my final toast. To my daughter and her husband, may your home be a sanctuary built on mutual respect and honest devotion. May you always remember that the greatest legacies aren't passed down through family crests or bank accounts, but through the simple acts of showing up, day in and day out, for one another. I held the glass aloft, and those gathered lifted their own in response. A hum of shared understanding rippled across the room. After the toast, the band's singer began a gentle ballad, and guests slowly drifted back to their seats or toward the exit. I guided Soraya and Elijah to the center of the dance floor for one final dance. As the soft notes of the piano and cello wove around us, I felt the memory of 1,000 moments converge, braiding hair before school, teaching her to ride her bike, comforting her through heartbreak, celebrating each milestone. Each moment had led to this dance. Father and daughter, now father and daughter-in-law, united in love's enduring rhythm. We moved together in a simple sway, the world outside that ballroom fading into insignificance. I closed my eyes as I guided her through the steps, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. When the melody reached its gentle crescendo, I whispered, "You did it, Soraya. You made this day more beautiful than I ever imagined." She leaned in and kissed my cheek, her lips soft and full of gratitude. "We did it together," she murmured, her breath warm against my skin. As the final chord lingered and the lights brightened, signaling the official end of the festivities, I looked across the room at Baron Fontaine. He approached, his gait measured, and extended a hand. For the first time that evening, he looked me in the eye. "Julius Merrick," he said, voice low, respectful. "I owe you an apology and my gratitude." I accepted his hand, feeling the firmness of his grip. "Thank you, Baron," I replied. "Respect is earned, not given." He nodded, a subtle shift in his expression signaling a new understanding. "I see now what true legacy means," he said, and turned away to join the departing guests. In that moment, I realized that respect, once earned, need not be loudly proclaimed. It was quietly acknowledged. The few guests who remained formed a loose circle around the dance floor, offering final congratulations and hugs. Malik clapped me on the back, grinning from ear to ear, and my sister enveloped me in a tearful embrace. Each gesture underscored the truth I had lived by, that love's unwavering presence begets respect, and respect, once paid, settles softly into the heart. Soraya slipped her arm through mine, and we walked together toward the exit, Elijah joining us on my other side. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp, fragrant with the bloom of jasmine in the nearby hedges. The crescent moon gleamed above, a silent witness to the day's triumph. I paused on the steps, looking back at the warmly lit ballroom windows. The guests had gone, the tables were emptying, and the final echo of laughter drifted into the night. I felt a surge of contentment, no longer the man overlooked, but a father recognized for the love he had poured into his daughter's life. She turned to me, eyes bright with joy. "Thank you for giving me my life," she said softly. I brushed her hair behind her ear and smiled. "No," I replied, voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving me mine." Together, we walked into the cool embrace of the night, leaving the ballroom's glow behind, but carrying its warmth within us. A beacon for the journey ahead, illuminated by the legacy of love that would guide us always.